I've been a trucker for close to 15 years now, and in that time I've seen my fair share of strange and unnerving things on the road. But nothing compares to what happened to me in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, heading to a destination in Arizona. I think I was delivering appliances, but to be honest, I don't really remember the specifics. What I do remember is the pitch-black darkness in every direction, a darkness so complete it felt like the desert had swallowed the world whole. The headlights on my semi were really dim at the time. I'd been putting off getting them fixed for a while, and usually it didn't make much of a difference. But on this night, with no other cars on the road, it was painfully obvious. I had to strain my eyes every few minutes just to make out the road ahead. That could have been a horror story in itself. I debated pulling over for a couple of hours to wait for sunrise, but I didn't want to waste time. I desperately needed the money, so I kept driving, figuring the straight line of the road would keep me safe enough. It must have been about an hour before sunrise when I saw something approaching fast in the distance. At first, I thought it might be an animal, so I slammed on the brakes. My truck screeched to a halt just a foot before hitting a car with its hazards on, parked dead center on the double yellow lines. The passenger door was wide open. Now, I'm a pretty fearless guy. I've been in my share of bar fights and know how to handle myself. But this situation made me uneasy. Still, I figured someone might need help, maybe a jump start or something. I reversed the semi and pulled over, deciding against throwing down flares since I hadn't seen another car all night. It was a warm, still night, almost eerily so. There was no wind, and the only sound was the faint click of the car's hazards. As I got closer, I saw it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. Approaching cautiously, I noticed the passenger door was wide open, but the car was empty, completely empty. I checked the back seat and anywhere someone might be lying down, but there was no one. That's when the unease really set in. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone might be watching me from the darkness. The problem was, it was so dark I couldn't see far beyond the dim headlights of my truck. It was eerie, to say the least. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to get back in my truck and drive away, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to keep investigating. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed normal. The key was even in the ignition, though the engine was off. I made my way to the trunk, figuring I might as well take a look. It wouldn't budge. Locked. I grabbed the key from the ignition and unlocked the trunk, but it still wouldn't open. It was jammed from the inside. I opened the back door and managed to access the trunk through the back seat. Inside, there were 3 squished garbage bags and a rope tying the trunk closed. I remember glancing over my shoulder one more time before reaching for the bags. The coast seemed clear, but just as I was about to touch one, the loudest gunshot I'd ever heard rang out into the night. I slammed my head on the roof of the car in shock. Without thinking, I threw the keys on the front seat and bolted back to my truck. As I was climbing in, I heard a grungy voice yelling in the distance. It was getting closer, fast. I started the semi and threw it into gear. As I began to pull away, I saw a figure standing by the trunk of the car. A short, husky man with red hair, wearing overalls and shin-high boots. He had a small shovel in one hand and an old hunting rifle in the other. Our eyes locked for a few seconds. He didn't look crazy, just worried. He dropped the shovel and started waving his hands, yelling for me to wait, but there was no way I was sticking around. I drove away as fast as I could, watching him in the rearview mirror as he chased after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. I drove for about 5 minutes, thinking I was in the clear. But then I saw headlights fast approaching behind me. I'd never felt so scared in my life. I called the police, doing my best to explain what had happened. The car was right on my tail, honking like crazy. I just kept driving, praying he wouldn't try to ram me. After what felt like an eternity, the car cut in front of me and hit the brakes, forcing me to slow down. I was about to crash when flashing police lights appeared ahead. The Ford veered off into the desert and disappeared. I pulled over, and an officer showed up. I frantically told him what had happened, but instead of chasing the guy, he took my report. I was furious, but he assured me they'd search the area once backup arrived. They never called me with an update. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. Most of them think the guy was burying bodies, but that small shovel and those garbage bags make me think otherwise. For my own sanity, I like to believe he was burying something else, maybe a diseased animal. Either way, I've never been totally comfortable driving through deserts late at night since then. I'm sure you've seen some of the more modern videos online where truckers document their daily routines and provide tips for each other. Maybe you haven't, but being on the younger side in this industry, I see them all the time on TikTok and YouTube Shorts. I had to drop out of a pretty prestigious university for personal reasons, and people often tell me I could have been more than a trucker. Honestly, it's not a bad gig. I've been making deliveries for over 2 years now. The only truly strenuous part of the job is the long hours. You can never really gauge how the isolation will affect you without experiencing it firsthand. My only advice is to make peace with any demons lurking in your subconscious, because they'll definitely eat at your brain during the lonely hours. That's what happened to me. Anyway, this happened 3 months after I got employed by my first company. I was basically as new to this trade as you could get. I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a 12-hour drive. 12 hours might not sound crazy, but considering I had just completed an 8-hour trip, it puts things into perspective. I wanted to get deliveries done as quickly as possible, so I opted to drive through the night. I'd get to Lafayette just before 3 a.m. Things were going smoothly. There were virtually no other cars on the road, so I was able to push the semi a little faster than normal. About halfway through the drive, I reached down to the center console to chug a Red Bull, but there weren't any. Of course, I had forgotten to restock my truck after my previous delivery. Frustrated, I slapped my dashboard a few times, realizing I'd have to stop somewhere. There's nothing I hate more than stopping during my drives. I might be unique in this, but I always get exponentially more tired when my vehicle is stationary, even if I'm only stopped for 20 seconds. After glancing at the navigation, I knew I had no choice, either fall asleep on the road or stop and get an energy drink. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service stop I saw. I had no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio. Too late, I realized this wasn't actually a service stop. It looked like an abandoned gas station with a repurposed convenience store. I figured I'd head to another quick stop store I saw not far up the road. I parked the semi and walked over to the first convenience store. To be honest, I was expecting one of two things: either the place would be open or the door would be locked. Imagine my surprise when the door swung open into a pitch-black store. I looked around, hoping to find a drink or snack left behind. Just before I turned around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw a faint glow emanating from a corner of the room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly opened the door to the back room where the glow was coming from. To my pleasant surprise, there was a plugged-in refrigerator against the wall. Eagerly, I opened the door but found nothing. The shelves had been removed, and the whole appliance had been gutted. As I was shutting the door, I was 90% certain I heard a clatter from the main room, like something hitting the floor. I froze for a good 10 seconds. Had I imagined it? There was no way. Quietly, I walked back into the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to keep investigating, but I didn't have time for this. I walked out the entrance door and jogged to the other shop. It was open, thank God. I paid for my drink and made it back to my truck. Something about this whole stop felt wrong, and I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed the door was now open. I was 100% positive I had shut it behind me. It wasn't my job to figure out what was going on, so I started the engine and merged my semi back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in, snapping me out of my tired haze pretty quickly. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how bizarre that whole thing had been. A squatter in an abandoned building wasn't the strangest thing in the world, but my brain couldn't explain that refrigerator, no matter what theory I thought of. I tried to forget about it and kept driving. Then, I started noticing weird movements in the curtain behind me. Sweat dripped down my forehead as I watched in the rearview mirror. The curtain seemed to billow and move, even though I didn't have the air on. I thought the worst, there was someone in my truck. I didn't have any weapons on me, so I discreetly punched in the nearest police station on my phone. The drive there was the most tense and horrifying 20 minutes of my life. I kept imagining that person reaching out to grab me or trying to crash my truck. Finally, I approached the police station. I stopped the semi as close as I could and ran to the station. In seconds, my truck was surrounded by police. When I opened the back, what I saw will stay with me for life. The police pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman wearing rags and nasty-looking blankets. One of the men was armed with 2 switchblades. All 3 refused to talk but stared menacingly at me as they were getting cuffed. I have no idea what they wanted, and I don't think I'll ever know.